So I just spent 6 months in Pakistan, not with the Code Pink delegation, but I was working with the FATA Research Center there, which does research on drone attacks and militancy in the tribal areas. So I was basically working with researchers who were and interviewing people who were being hit by drone strikes, who were in areas that were hit by militancy. I actually didn't know we had a slide projector. I don't have any fancy slides, so I'm sorry. But so anyway, I guess to put everything in context, you have to go into a little bit about the political context in which militancy is occurring and the war on terror is occurring, specifically in the tribal regions of Pakistan, where South Waziristan, North Waziristan are. That's sort of the hotspot where militancy is occurring, where the counterattacks are occurring, where American intervention is going on. So a detailed discussion of that would take a very long time, but I'll try and briefly go over the military history, the political history of it. And I'll start with the Afghan War, the first Afghan War. Well, the first modern Afghan War, we'll say. So the Soviet invasion, I mean, that's a pretty well-known story. This sort of the roots of the Afghan Taliban. It's fairly well known. The role of the Pakistani province is a little bit more complex. So in 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up the communist government in Kabul, first thing that happened was there were hundreds of thousands of refugees that streamed over the border into the tribal areas. The border is very porous. It is never clearly defined. The Pashtuns, the tribes that live there, never really recognized the border as something serious. So the infrastructure there was fairly underdeveloped. There wasn't much in the way of schools. There wasn't much in the way of hospitals. There wasn't much in the way of basically any sort of civil service. It's mostly a pastoral economy based on livestock, very small agricultural production. So basically a huge wave of people crossed the border and then they were stuck. So you had this phenomenon of gigantic refugee camps full of Afghan refugees that were in the tribal areas without any civil services. At this time, Pakistan was under the rule of General Zia-ul-Haq, and he is the guy that started the blasphemy laws and basically set Pakistan on the trend to becoming sort of a fundamentalist Islamic state. He saw this as an opportunity. He seized it. He sort of positioned himself as the middleman for the American counterattack or the proxy war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. So he said, look, give me a bunch of money and I will give these proxy guys that we've been using in Kashmir. I mean, the infrastructure actually for these militant groups was already in place at a very small scale, but they were using them to engage in proxy war against India over the Kashmir region. So he basically said, look, I'll turn these guys loose on the Soviets if you give me money and you prop up my collapsing economy. Actually, at this point, the Pakistani economy was on the verge of collapse. They had just lost the war in Bangladesh's independence war. So there was a huge political and economic crisis at the time. Now, this influx of weapons and money from the United States, well, actually, there was a lot of Saudi money also, petrodollars. That consolidated the military control over Pakistan because he was a dictator. The factions giving him political support were obviously the military officers. So basically, this is also a fairly well-known story. The Afghan Mujahideen that would later become the Taliban and also the Northern Alliance, they used the tribal regions as sort of a staging point. They would attack over the border, then come back. The Soviet Union couldn't cross that border because it was a sovereign border, but these tribal insurgents could. They also used these areas to pick up new recruits, actually. This was a very fruitful area to pick up recruits from, and that's because these extremist groups, they sort of preach a radical version of Islam called Wahhabism. It's not technically Wahhabism because that refers to the ideology of the Saudi state, but it's a variant of that, and I mean that's basically the jihad that never ceases, jihad against the invader, and the establishment of an Islamic State. So these groups were being funded through the Zia government by the United States and Saudi Arabia. And like I said before, there's no infrastructure, there's no school systems, there's no hospitals. Food is very hard to find there. So what happens is the only people that are actually providing these services to the people in the refugee camps are these extremist groups. They provide training, they provide arms, they provide schools for the kids to go to, and actually they were helped along by their American partners, especially the University of Nebraska. They put in about $35.4 million in producing books for madrasas, which are religious schools. And so the math textbooks would have examples of things, would have examples like a Kalashnikov bullet travels at 800 meters per second. Mujahid has the forehead of a Russian in his sights 3,200 meters away. How many seconds will it take the bullet to hit the Russian's forehead? You can actually, when I was over there, you can still find copies of these books. They're really terrifying. But so the ideological component of American support was huge. They basically increased the reach of these extremist groups in order to provide sort of warm bodies for the insurgency against the Soviet Union. I should say here, it's important to note that you have a distinction here between the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban. The Afghan Taliban they sort of came to power in the mid-90s. They're usually a cohesive group. They have the explicit goal first of it was eradicating the Northern Alliance and establishing the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. And now their explicit goal is to remove the United States, NATO, ISAF forces from Afghanistan. The Pakistani Taliban, it's sort of a different beast. When you hear the news refer to the Taliban, what they're actually referring to is it's sort of an umbrella group of about 32 different organizations, and each of them have their own stated goals, their political aims, their ideologies. So, for example, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan is extremist Sunni group, but they're anti-Pakistani government. There are some groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed, I believe. They are actually pro-Pakistani government. I mean, they share common ideological features like, extreme Sunnism and general opposition to the war in Afghanistan. But there are a few that are just personality cults. I mean, personality cults, and they have very different programs, very different methods. So after the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, the tribal regions in Pakistan basically faded into insignificance for the next 10 or 15 years or so, as the Afghan Taliban took over Afghanistan. In 1996, in FATA, the federally administrated tribal areas, universal suffrage was granted to the people of FATA. Prior to this time, the tribal areas did not count under the provincial system of Pakistan, so they basically had no right to vote, and their government was directly administered by the president through a system of political agents. Now, this was a system that was started by the British and kept up by the Pakistani government. So what happens in this case is you have, well, I should also add that after despite having universal suffrage, the action of political parties was still banned in the province. So what happened is you have universal suffrage, the only people who are organized are the extremist militant groups. So you have a wave of extremist mullahs, extremist clergy, that all of a sudden are winning seats and political legitimacy in parliament. This is where you really see the power of Jamaat Islami, Jamaat-e-Ulama Islami, and all these far-right religious groups. So they sort of gain their credibility through the elections, and then they're also associated with these fighters that fought in Afghanistan and came back, and they have money, they have guns, they have prestige. So how do you fight against this tide of reactionary ideology washing over Pakistan and the rest of the world? But how do you do it in a way that doesn't encourage the deaths, the needless deaths of many, countless people? When we talk about solutions, we have to first figure out what the problem is. The problem isn't just militancy. The problem isn't just drone attacks. The problem is a neoliberal global system that produces these. They're sort of symptoms of the same problem. In Pakistan specifically, the military, there are 4 military corporations that own, that collectively produce $20 billion worth of output. That's 14% of Pakistan's GDP. So the largest industrialist in the country is the military. So you have that, and then you have the other side, which are the feudal agriculturalists. 300 families in Pakistan own about 65% of the agricultural land. So when you have that kind of situation, you don't have a lot of space for people who are progressive, people who are trying to fight for a better world, because you have the military crushing you from one side and the landlords crushing you from the other side. The reason that this is happening is because, first of all, to support its imperialist adventures in South Asia and Central Asia, the U.S. is funding the Pakistani military very heavily, to the tune of $1.6 billion in 2011. The other thing is that the U.S. supports this neoliberal trade regime, which allows the agriculturalists and the industrialists, who are also the military, to cut wages and increase their own production at the expense of not only their own working class, but the global working class. So we have to identify the problem here. The problem isn't, you can't say, oh, well, if you're pro-drone, you're anti-Taliban. If you're anti-drone, you're pro-Taliban. It doesn't work like that. There are two sides of the same coin. Now, as far as what we can do, given that, Glenn Ford likes to say from Black Agenda Report, when you're in the belly of the beast, your goal should be to disarm the beast. So as peace activists in the United States, I believe that's what we should be working on now. How do you do that? Well, I mean, as I said, the electoral system is not going to provide that for you. The only thing that's going to provide it is unified mass action by the masses of people who are the ones who are affected by this, but also they're the ones who can affect this. I mean, if you've been paying attention to the Walmart strike, it started with 32 workers, right? And then it increased, and they managed to shut down the largest Walmart distribution center on the continent, something to the tune of $36 billion or something like that. $12 billion, still a significant amount of money in one day. And actually, that's still going on. Walmart was just hit by a minimum wage lawsuit, and also they're actually revising their wage policies in fear of a Black Friday walkout. So I think this is, I mean, you know, it's Walmart. It's not, well, imagine if it was Northrop Grumman or McDonnell Douglas or one of the companies that manufactures Global Hawks, the drone that fires Hellfire missiles. But it doesn't even need to be that. I mean, you need to hit the beast where it hurts, which is the military-industrial complex. And